Lily had always loved jogging through the park at dusk, the serenity of the evening air clearing her mind after a long day. But recently, she noticed someone was following her. It started with a feeling, an unease that grew with each passing day. She caught glimpses of a person just out of sight, always keeping pace with her but never getting close enough to identify. She changed her route, but the figure followed. One evening, she decided to confront her pursuer. Stopping abruptly, she turned and shouted, "Who's there?" Silence answered her. The figure stood at the edge of the path, shrouded in shadows, and then melted away into the trees. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Lily started carrying her phone with her, ready to call for help. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she felt the familiar presence. This time, she didn't stop. She quickened her pace, hearing footsteps behind her matching her speed. Her heart pounded in her chest as she dashed through the park, but no matter how fast she ran, the footsteps stayed with her. She reached her apartment, slamming the door behind her and locking it. Panting, she looked through the peephole but saw nothing. That night, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Why did you run?" it read. Lily's blood ran cold. She looked around her apartment, checking every window and door, but found no signs of a break-in. For days, she received messages, each one more disturbing than the last. They described her daily routines, what she wore, where she went, all in chilling detail. Lily contacted the police, but they could do little without more evidence. One night, as she sat in her living room, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a picture of her, taken from outside her window. She jumped up, pulling the curtains shut, and called the police. As she waited for them to arrive, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her door, slow and deliberate, growing louder and closer. As she waited for the police, the footsteps in the hallway grew louder and closer, each step a menacing promise of what was to come. Lily's hands trembled as she dialed 911 again, her voice barely above a whisper as she relayed her urgent need for immediate assistance. The operator assured her help was on the way, but the seconds stretched into an eternity. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped right outside her door. Lily held her breath, the silence more terrifying than the sound of approaching footsteps. Her phone buzzed again, and she reluctantly glanced at it. Another message from the unknown number, "I'm here." Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked at the door, half expecting it to burst open. Then, there was a soft knock, almost polite, followed by a voice she didn't recognize. "Lily, it's me. Open the door." She backed away, her mind racing. The voice was calm, almost soothing, but it didn't match anyone she knew. "The police are on their way," she shouted, hoping to scare him off. The voice responded, "You won't need them. I just want to talk." Lily's fear turned to anger. "Leave me alone," she screamed, clutching her phone like a lifeline. She glanced around the room for a weapon, her eyes landing on a heavy lamp. She grabbed it, holding it up like a club. The door handle rattled, and then the knocking stopped. Lily's phone buzzed again. Another picture, this time of her standing in her living room, lamp in hand, taken from the window behind her. She spun around, but the window was dark, the curtains drawn. She realized with a sickening feeling that he was inside the building. The police would take time to arrive, and she was on her own until then. She needed to find a safer place to hide. She moved towards her bedroom, where she could lock herself in and wait for help. As she entered the room, she heard the soft creak of the front door opening. Her pulse raced as she locked the bedroom door behind her, pushing a dresser against it for good measure. She crouched by the bed, clutching the lamp, her breath shallow and quick. The apartment was silent again, but she knew he was out there, somewhere. Minutes passed like hours. She heard the faint sound of footsteps moving through her apartment, searching. She kept her eyes on the door, every nerve on edge. Then, she heard a scraping sound at the bedroom window. She turned her head slowly, seeing a shadow move outside the window. Her heart nearly stopped. He was trying to get in. With trembling hands, she picked up her phone to call the police again, but the signal was gone. No bars, no connection. She was completely cut off. The scraping at the window grew louder, more insistent. Just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she heard the distant wail of sirens. Relief flooded her as the sound grew louder. The intruder must have heard it too, because the scraping stopped. For a moment, there was silence, then hurried footsteps moving away from her apartment. Lily waited, still and silent, until she heard a loud knock at her door and the authoritative voice of a police officer calling her name. She moved the dresser and opened the door, rushing into the arms of the officers who had come to her rescue. The police searched her apartment and the surrounding area but found no trace of the intruder. The pictures on her phone and the messages were the only evidence of his presence. The experience left her shaken, but she was determined to find out who had been stalking her in WHY. As the days turned into weeks, the police investigation continued, but the unknown number remained untraceable. Lily couldn't shake the feeling that, despite the police's assurances, the silent pursuer was still out there, watching and waiting for his next move. As Mark worked on securing Lily's devices, she felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe this nightmare would finally end. Days passed without any new messages or sightings of the shadowy figure. Slowly, she began to relax, feeling a semblance of normalcy returning to her life. One evening, she decided to take a short walk around her neighborhood, something she hadn't dared to do in weeks. The air was crisp and cool, the streets quiet and serene. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. She took a deep breath, savoring the moment as she rounded the corner near her apartment. She saw a man standing under a street lamp. He was tall, with a hood pulled low over his face. Her heart skipped a beat. The man turned his head slowly, and though she couldn't see his eyes, she felt his gaze pierce through her. She froze, fear gripping her once again. The man took a step forward and then another. Lily's mind raced. She couldn't go back to her apartment, it was too close. Instead, she bolted down the street, her footsteps echoing loudly in the still night. She ran towards a nearby coffee shop that was still open. The man's footsteps pounded behind her, getting closer. She burst through the door of the coffee shop, startling the few patrons inside. She looked back, but the man had stopped at the entrance, remaining in the shadows. Breathless and trembling, Lily called the police again. They arrived quickly, but once more, the man had vanished without a trace. The officers took her statement and offered to escort her home. She agreed, feeling safer with their presence. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every sound, every creak of the apartment, made her jump. She sat in her living room, clutching the pepper spray and her phone. Hours passed, and just as dawn began to break, her phone buzzed. She hesitated, then looked at the screen. It was another message from the unknown number. "You can't hide forever." Fear turned to determination. She couldn't live like this any longer. She decided to leave the city, to start anew somewhere far away. She informed the police of her decision, packed her belongings, and within days, she was on a train heading to a small town miles away in her new town. Life was quiet and slow. She found a job, made new friends, and for a while the fear subsided. But she remained vigilant, always checking her surroundings, always wary of strangers. Months went by without incident, and she began to believe she had finally escaped her silent pursuer. One night, as she sat on her porch enjoying the cool evening air, she received a text from an unknown number. Her blood ran cold as she read the message. "Found you." She looked around, her heart pounding, but saw nothing unusual. Determined not to let fear rule her life again, she stood up, her hands steady. She knew she couldn't run forever, but she could fight. She was ready for whatever came next, prepared to confront the darkness that had haunted her for so long. As she stared into the encroaching night, she whispered, "Bring it on." Jake's new house was everything he had dreamed of. Spacious, quiet, and nestled at the edge of a thick forest. It was a perfect escape from the bustle of city life. But soon after moving in, he began to hear footsteps echoing through the halls at odd hours. At first, he thought it was the house settling, but the footsteps were too deliberate, too rhythmic. They seemed to follow him from room to room, stopping just outside the door he was in. His dog, Max, would growl at empty hallways, the hair on his back standing on end. One night, the footsteps grew bolder, sounding directly above his bedroom. Jake grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the attic, but found nothing. He installed motion detectors, but they never registered anything unusual. The footsteps continued, unrelenting, as if taunting him. Desperate, Jake invited friends over, hoping to convince himself it was all in his head. But even they heard the footsteps, echoing through the house in the dead of night. One friend suggested the house might be haunted, but Jake dismissed it. He didn't believe in ghosts. One evening, while working late in his study, he heard a creaking behind him. Turning around, he saw nothing but felt a cold breath on his neck. Heart racing, he grabbed his flashlight and shone it around. There, in the beam, was a faint outline of a figure, barely visible, but unmistakably present. The figure moved towards him, its steps echoing loudly in the silent house. Jake backed away, stumbling over furniture, but the figure kept advancing. He bolted out of the house, vowing never to return alone. Jake's nights were increasingly sleepless as the footsteps grew louder and more relentless. The sense of being watched, the unnerving creaks, and the occasional cold breath on his neck left him in a perpetual state of anxiety. The motion detectors had shown nothing, and his friends had stopped visiting, too frightened by the house's ominous presence. One night, driven by desperation, Jake decided to confront whatever was haunting him. Armed with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, he ascended to the attic once more. The footsteps followed him, louder than ever, echoing in the narrow stairway to the top. He stood still, the attic stale air thick with anticipation. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dusty boxes and old furniture. But then he saw it. A faint, shimmering outline near the far wall, almost imperceptible but definitely there. "Who are you? What do you want?" Jake demanded, his voice trembling. The outline flickered and then solidified into the faint image of a man, his features indistinct but eyes glowing a ghostly blue. "This is my home," the apparition whispered, the words seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Why are you haunting me?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The figure's expression seemed to shift, sorrow etched into its ghostly features. "I lived here long ago, died here, alone. I can't leave, but you can." Jake felt a pang of sympathy amidst his fear. "How can I help you move on?" The ghost's eyes met his, filled with a yearning for peace. "Find my remains. Give me a proper burial." Determined, Jake spent the next few days researching the history of the house and its previous owners. He discovered that in the late 1800s, a man named Thomas had lived there. Thomas was believed to have disappeared, but locals whispered he had died in the house, his body never found. Armed with this knowledge, Jake began searching the attic and the cellar for any hidden compartments or unusual floorboards. Finally, in a dusty corner of the cellar, he found it. A loose board covering a small cavity. Inside, wrapped in decaying cloth, were bones. Jake carefully gathered Thomas's remains and arranged for a proper burial in the local cemetery. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, a sense of calm washed over him. That night, the house was eerily quiet. The oppressive presence lifted days turned into weeks without a single echoing step or cold breath on his neck. The house felt lighter, almost welcoming. Jake felt a profound relief, knowing he had helped a lost soul find peace. One evening, as he sat in his study, the room filled with a soft, warm glow. Turning, he saw Thomas standing there, not as a ghost but as a solid figure, eyes no longer glowing but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," Thomas said, his voice clear and warm. "I'm free now." With that, Thomas faded, leaving Jake alone in the quiet, serene house. Jake knew the haunting was over, replaced by a sense of fulfillment. He had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, bringing peace to both himself and a restless spirit. From then on, Jake lived in harmony with his home, the echoes of the past no longer a haunting presence but a reminder of the peace he had helped to restore. Emma had always taken the same route home from work, a routine she found comforting. The narrow streets, dimly lit by aging street lamps, had become a familiar, albeit eerie, backdrop to her evening walks. That night, she noticed a shadow that seemed to move with her, just a few steps behind Aditi first. She dismissed it as paranoia, but as the days turned into weeks, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The figure never got too close, always maintaining a distance, lurking in the periphery of her vision. Emma confided in friends, but they brushed it off as stress. One night, as she rounded the corner to her apartment, she heard footsteps that stopped when she did. Heart pounding, she spun around, catching a glimpse of a dark silhouette ducking into an alleyway. Emma hurried inside, locking the door behind her, but the sense of dread lingered. Days turned into nights of restless sleep. Each time she closed her eyes, the shadow seemed to creep closer. She installed cameras around her apartment, hoping to catch a glimpse of her stalker. One morning, reviewing the footage, she froze. There it was, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the camera's view, watching her window. Terrified, she called the police, but they found no evidence of anyone being there. Emma's fear turned into a quiet desperation. She started carrying pepper spray, changing her routes, but the feeling of being followed never ceased. Then one night, the power went out. Emma, alone in her dark apartment, felt a presence behind her. She turned slowly, and the shadow stepped into the dim moonlight filtering through the window. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure moved closer, the darkness around it seeming to pulse with a life of its own. Emma's scream was swallowed by the night. Emma stood frozen as the shadowy figure stepped closer, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The air around her seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. Summoning every ounce of courage, she swung the pepper spray in front of her and pressed the trigger. The shadow recoiled, hissing, but it didn't retreat far. The room seemed to darken as the figure advanced again, its form growing more solid, more menacing. Emma backed into a corner, her mind racing. The pepper spray had only bought her a moment. She needed a plan. Desperately, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but there was no signal. Panic surged through her. The figure stepped closer, its eyes burning into hers. Just as it was about to reach her, Emma remembered the cameras she had installed. With trembling hands, she grabbed the remote for the cameras and began to play the footage from the previous night on her TV screen. The figure paused, its attention shifting to the screen. Emma fast-forwarded through hours of empty rooms until she found it. The shadowy figure standing outside her window, watching her. As the figure on the screen moved, so did the one in her apartment. They were in sync, as if bound by the recording. Emma's heart pounded as she realized she had discovered its weakness. She rewound the footage to a moment when the figure had vanished from view. The shadow in her apartment flickered, its form wavering. Emma rewound further, to a time before it had appeared. The shadow grew fainter, its power seeming to diminish. Desperation fueled her actions as she rewound to the point where she first installed the cameras. The shadow thinned, almost becoming transparent. Then she made a bold move. She rewound the footage to the day before she first noticed the figure, before it had started haunting her. The shadow let out a bone-chilling scream and dissolved into nothingness. Emma collapsed on the floor, shaking. The apartment was silent, the oppressive presence gone. She called the police, who arrived to find her pale and trembling but unharmed. They reviewed the footage, puzzled by the strange events but finding no evidence of an intruder. And the days that followed, Emma moved out of the apartment, unable to shake the memory of the shadowy figure. She found a new place in a bustling part of the city, filled with light and people. Slowly, she began to rebuild her sense of security. One night, as she settled into her new home, she received an email from an unknown address. The subject line read, "I will always be watching." With a trembling hand, she opened it. It contained a single, haunting image. A dark silhouette standing outside her new apartment, watching her window. Emma knew then that the shadow was not bound to her old apartment. It was bound to her. But she was stronger now, ready to face whatever came next. She installed new cameras, fortified her new home, and refused to let fear control her life as she stared out the window into the night. She whispered to herself, "I'm ready for you."